The moment Jasmine Crockett rose against Vice President J.D. Vance, the room changed. A fierce exchange erupted into a national spectacle, 9 million viewers in 2 days. She tore through his defenses, exposed his secrets, and unveiled a recording so shocking it paralyzed the chamber. By nightfall, Vance's power crumbled. What did Crockett unleash that left him broken before the nation? Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. In a capital thick with unease, the House chamber filled with lawmakers, aides, and press all bracing for impact. The country was bitterly divided, one side demanding continued aid to Ukraine, the other calling it a reckless drain. This emergency hearing wasn't just about policy. It was about power, morality, and who would define America's role in the world. The air buzzed with quiet calculation. Underneath polished suits and rehearsed smiles, war was brewing. J.D. Vance entered with cold precision, tailored, composed, exuding authority. To some, he was the future of conservative politics. To others, a symbol of betrayal. Once a Trump critic, now Trump's vice president, his transformation reeked of ambition, dressed up as conviction. Every step he took was a reminder this wasn't about truth, it was about control. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat calm, composed, coiled. Her presence cut through the room's performance. A former defense attorney from Texas, now a congresswoman with the sharpest tongue on the Hill. She didn't come to posture, she came to defend those left out of the America First narrative. No notes, no hesitation. Just a mind built for cross-examination and a heart that had seen too much to stay silent. Two visions of America, two weapons of conviction, and only one microphone between them. And then, like a gavel striking the bench, J.D. Vance took the floor. His voice smooth, his argument sharp and ready to redefine morality on his terms. J.D. Vance stepped forward, not with hesitation, but with intention. Every movement crisp, every word poised like a chess piece dropped with purpose. He didn't clear his throat or soften his posture. He didn't need to. The room had been waiting for him, and he knew it. His hand grazed the side of the podium, knuckles tapping wood like it was a gavel of his own making. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to shout. Because men like J.D. Vance learned long ago that calmness, when paired with power, often cuts deeper than outrage. Foreign aid is not a moral obligation. He began his voice low, even and disturbingly composed. It is a political choice. He let the sentence sit unchallenged like a verdict already rendered. And we have chosen to prioritize our borders, our schools, our people. He wasn't pleading, he was declaring. And as he spoke, you could almost hear the applause forming in the minds of his base, the ones who had been told that helping others meant abandoning themselves. He paused again, his silence saying, "I dare you to disagree." Then with all the ease of someone who's never had to explain the price of survival, he added, "Ukraine's war is tragic, but it is their war, not ours." Every word was sharpened to cut through compassion, not because he didn't understand suffering, but because he had learned to package suffering as something optional, something foreign. And in a nation that was growing weary of headlines about missile strikes and refugee camps, his words weren't just political, they were performative. Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved. Her stillness wasn't passive, it was precise. She had heard words like his before, from prosecutors, from politicians, from men who could explain away injustice with logic, so clean it left no blood at the scene. But she felt the blood. She always had. Not metaphorically, literally. On the sidewalks outside her district office. In the eyes of the mothers who came to her, not for promises, but for protection. Her silence wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of someone letting their opponent speak just long enough to hang himself with his own rope. And then he gave her the final nod. He said it not with anger, but with that chilling, dismissive certainty of someone who'd never had to choose between running or dying. War, Vance said, is a choice, not destiny. That sentence didn't just land, it detonated. Jasmine didn't look down. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't rehearse a single syllable. She placed her hand gently on the microphone, not to steady herself, but to steady the moment. "You once called Trump the American Hitler," she said quietly, "and now you defend his playbook with a straight face?" The chamber shifted. You could feel it. That subtle flick of eyes from one aide to another. the sudden stillness in the air. The rustle of papers stopped. Even the phones, those ever-buzzing, always recording devices, seemed to pause as if unsure how to frame what had just been said. J.D. Vance didn't respond. He couldn't not immediately. His mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. Not denial, not defense, only silence. And in politics, silence speaks volumes. The camera caught it, the flicker in his eyes, the twitch at his jaw, the momentary crack in the performance. This wasn't a typical exchange. This wasn't about polling points or sound bites. It was about something deeper: accountability. And for a man who had built his rise on carefully shifting allegiances, Jasmine's words were more than a challenge. They were a mirror. And for the first time that day, J.D. Vance didn't seem to like what he saw in it. But Jasmine didn't stop at exposing his hypocrisy on Ukraine, because the real danger, she knew, wasn't just in what J.D. Vance said aloud, but in what he whispered when he thought no one would hear. She moved with purpose, not anger. There was no raised voice, no grand gesture, just the kind of calm that only comes from holding truth like a weapon. Jasmine reached beneath her folder and unfolded a single sheet of paper. Standard print, black text, no logos, no dramatics. "I have here an internal campaign email," she began, voice low but unwavering, dated October 12th, 2024, marked confidential, sent from J.D. Vance to his senior communications team. The document was then projected behind her, sterile, simple, and damning. She didn't need to embellish it. She let the audience read it for themselves. "We can't keep letting this trans agenda infect our message. It's a cultural pandemic and we're losing ground." The impact was immediate, not loud, but seismic. There were no gasps, just a stillness that comes when people realize they're sitting inside a moral fault line. Staffers froze mid-typing. A senator 2 rows back stopped mid-sip. Even those who had dismissed Jasmine before were now silent, not because they suddenly agreed with her, but because they knew the public was watching, and some lines don't wash off easily. She paused, not to savor the moment, but to let the poison reveal itself. Then with surgical precision, she advanced to the next slide. This time it wasn't just words on paper, it was video. Low resolution, dated but unmistakable. J.D. Vance at a town hall in Iowa, standing under a Faith and Freedom First banner, speaking not off the cuff, but with prepared certainty. They don't need rights. They need treatment. Jasmine didn't turn to the screen. She didn't need to look at it. She remembered it by heart. She turned instead to the man himself. "Is this," she asked, locking eyes with him, "the moral compass of a vice president of the United States?" He didn't answer. Not right away. And that silence, sharp, heavy, unguarded, told the chamber more than any spin team ever could. His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze dropped for the briefest second, and then flicked upward, like a man scrambling for a mask he hadn't realized had fallen. But Jasmine wasn't speaking to him alone. She was speaking to every person who had been told their existence was a problem to be solved. To every young trans kid who'd watched people like Vance climb ladders by stepping on their dignity. She didn't lecture. She didn't perform. She simply told the truth with the kind of clarity that doesn't need volume to be deafening. She was done reading his words. Now she was making sure America didn't forget them. Just when it seemed Jasmine had already laid bare the full scope of Vance's contradictions, she took one final deliberate breath and reached into the darkness. Because some truths don't live on the record. Some are buried behind closed doors, and it takes courage to drag them into the light. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every movement was deliberate, as if the weight of what she was about to reveal required reverence, not spectacle. Jasmine's fingers brushed the small remote in her hand, and with a single click, the screens lining the hearing room came to life, not with a headline, not with a press clip, but with something far more dangerous: truth unscripted. The footage was unpolished, time-stamped, raw in its authenticity. It hadn't been released to the media. It wasn't intended for public eyes, and yet here it was, projected for the country to see. A private meeting caught on internal surveillance between Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The lighting was dim, the room stark. No advisors, no podiums, no polished messaging, just the harsh quiet of unchecked power. The scene played like a slow burn. Trump did most of the talking, gesturing with grandiosity, occasionally thumping the table for effect. Zelensky sat composed, polite, but visibly worn, the kind of exhaustion only war can carve into a face. And then J.D. Vance leaned in. His posture was relaxed, one ankle crossed over the other, but his tone cut like frost. Ukraine should learn to defend itself the way Texas does its border, he said. There was no hesitation, no irony, just a smirk not wide enough to be noticed by the average eye, but wide enough for the truth to slip through. The sentence dropped like shrapnel, cold and casual, as if the suffering of a sovereign nation could be compared to a campaign slogan, as if bombs and tanks were the same as border fences. No one in the room responded, not immediately. In the footage, Zelensky's face didn't shift, but his eyes did. It was a long, silent look, less shock, more recognition. The kind of look given by someone who has met too many men like this. Men who speak of strategy without ever standing in rubble. Men who speak of sacrifice without ever once making one. The video paused. The silence in the chamber was immediate and absolute. Jasmine stepped forward not with fury but with force. Her eyes locked onto Vance, but her voice was directed to something bigger than him. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply spoke, and the truth did the rest. You insult a nation bleeding for its sovereignty, she said, her voice even steady, impossible to ignore, while never once wearing the uniform of your own. The kind of recognition that can't be spun or denied. Some people looked down. Others looked at Vance. He didn't move, but something in him broke posture. Not visibly, but internally, undeniably. A slight twitch at the jaw, a breath taken in and held too long. The telltale signs of a man caught not in a lie, but in the mirror of his own cowardice. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. The footage had done the speaking. Her words had done the cutting, and now the silence was doing the judging. In a country where bravado often passes for leadership, she had just reminded everyone of what real moral authority looks like and what it doesn't. But just as the weight of his silence began to settle, J.D. Vance pivoted, reaching for an old familiar scapegoat, unaware that Jasmine had been waiting for that exact move. He leaned in as if ready to reset the room, his tone colder, more precise, the kind of delivery crafted not in truth, but in strategy. J.D. Vance was no stranger to cultural flashpoints, and today he reached for one he'd used before, one that always drew nods from loyalists and silence from the unsure. What we're seeing, he began, is a breakdown of values driven by an agenda that distorts biology, erodes faith, and destabilizes our social ecosystem. His words came clipped, measured, less like an argument, more like a diagnosis. He didn't say transgender outright, but the implication didn't need spelling out. Everyone in the room could feel it like a sudden draft from a door left open too long. We need to stop pretending that gender ideology is harmless, he continued, because it's not. And then came the final blow, dressed in soft, dangerous certainty. They're not just confused, they're creating confusion. He let the phrase hang. He was used to that moment, the pause where people either clapped or looked away, not because they agreed or disagreed, but because the subject made them uncomfortable enough to pretend neutrality. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat. She didn't look at anyone else. What she did instead was slower, more deliberate. She reached across the table and tapped a small screen embedded in the desk before her. The lights in the room dimmed slightly, and the large monitor behind her lit up clean, white text against a black background. She said nothing at first. The question did the speaking. Who defunded the National Cancer Research Initiative in 2023? The font was plain. The tone was not. Then another tap. Who slashed education funding by 14% while increasing private prison contracts? Another tap. Who was accused of paying $32 million in hush money to silence a sexual misconduct case involving a news network executive turned political consultant, and then she turned fully calmly to face him. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Trump, she said, or transgender Americans. The room did not erupt. It froze. The silence that followed wasn't filled with outrage. It was filled with reckoning. The kind that makes people breathe slower, hearts beat harder, minds run faster. No one was confused about who the questions were really for, and no one could answer without indicting the very machine they sat inside. J.D. Vance didn't respond immediately. His mouth tightened, but his eyes flicked left, then down, then back to neutral. It was a subtle reaction, but in that chamber, where body language was its own language, the message was clear. He didn't expect that. Not the precision of it, not the restraint, not the way she'd peeled off his moral armor without ever raising her voice. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't break eye contact. Her face remained still stern but not performative. This wasn't a performance. This was personal. Not because she herself was transgender, but because she understood exactly what it meant to be used as a rhetorical weapon in a room full of people pretending to debate lives instead of acknowledging them. She had seen it in courts, in hearings, in neighborhoods with no cameras, no headlines, no defense. She had stood beside too many people whose identities were politicized into threats, people who never asked to be symbols, only to be left alone. And so she asked the question not for applause, but for clarity. Not to win a moment, but to unmask a pattern. Because in a country where real corruption was being sanitized behind patriotic branding, it was always easier to blame the vulnerable than confront the powerful. J.D. Vance had just tried to do that, and Jasmine had answered not with ideology, but with receipts. The silence persisted, not empty, charged. It was the sound of a narrative collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Even those who didn't agree with her were forced to reckon with the brutal arithmetic of her logic. Because at the end of the day, there was no spinning her question, no parsing it, no redirect, only truth. And it had landed exactly where she intended center mass. But Jasmine wasn't done dismantling the myth of merit, because sometimes the most dangerous kind of injustice isn't loud. It's the one that hides in silence, protected by title wrapped in privilege and archived in confidential letters no one was ever supposed to read. She reached into her leather case, not hurried, not dramatic, but with the calm certainty of someone retrieving a weapon that could not be unfired. The folder she pulled out wasn't marked classified or explosive. It was plain. The color of manila, the kind of document that disappears easily into drawers, into filing cabinets, into memory holes. But Jasmine Crockett knew its weight. She'd seen too many like it. Too many stories buried under reputations. Too many mistakes quietly erased while others paid for far less with everything they had. She laid it on the desk gently with the same reverence one might reserve for something sacred or something damning. This she began, her voice low, but unwavering as a sealed disciplinary letter from Yale Law School's Academic Ethics Committee, dated April 2009. Her tone didn't shift. It didn't need to. The stillness in the room grew heavier with every syllable. Even the sound of paper sliding open felt sharp against the air. It states that Mr. J.D. Vance submitted a portion of his capstone thesis containing language lifted nearly word for word from a policy paper published 2 years earlier. There was no gasp, no immediate outburst, only the kind of silence that grows when a powerful name meets a truth it can't explain away. J.D. Vance didn't flinch, but he blinked twice in quick succession. He sat up straighter. It wasn't the posture of innocence, it was the posture of calculation. He was bracing for fallout. He was already searching for angles, but Jasmine wasn't offering escape. She was offering exposure. She held up the page, clean, legible damning. It was reviewed quietly. No public record. No formal penalty, she said as the document's text appeared on the screen behind her. Lines highlighted, dates underlined, because he was a dean scholar, because protecting the name mattered more than protecting the standard. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They were surgical, controlled, made to bleed only where it hurt most. A ripple passed through the chamber, not outrage, not disbelief, but discomfort. Staffers lowered their eyes. Aides shifted in their seats. Every person who had ever benefited from or turned a blind eye to a quiet favor suddenly felt seen. J.D. Vance stared forward, hands folded, face tight. But even through his stillness, a flicker passed something quick, something unmistakable. Not shame, not remorse, just exposure. Jasmine leaned forward, not in aggression, but in conviction. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened, steadied. "We talk so much about integrity in these halls," she said. We prosecute students young and poor for using AI to finish a paragraph. We ruin their careers. We shatter their future for one copied sentence. She paused not to breathe but to let the weight settle. Then came the line measured final, impossible to dismiss. Then what is morality if not justice for everyone? Or is it only reserved for those with the right political connections? It was not a question. It was an indictment of systems of privilege, of the quiet hypocrisy that lets the powerful walk away untouched, while others drown in the same waters for less. Her words hung in the air like a held breath. No one moved. No one dared to fill the space, because in that moment Jasmine wasn't just speaking to J.D. Vance. She was speaking to every closed-door meeting, every quiet deal, every rule bent in favor of a name someone didn't want tarnished. And in that silence, something shifted, not publicly, not loudly, but deeply. Because there was no defense, no righteous outrage, no rebuttal rehearsed well enough to erase what she had just put on record. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't press. She simply let the truth sit there, undeniable, unspun, unavoidable. What she had just done wasn't a takedown. It was a recalibration. A moment where the facade cracked not because someone yelled, but because someone finally refused to stay quiet. And in that refusal, she made the room and the country look inward. Because if merit was ever real, it would stand up to truth. And today it hadn't. But power, when exposed, doesn't crumble quietly, it lashes out. And as Jasmine methodically stripped away the last layers of illusion, J.D. Vance, for the first time, couldn't hold the mask in place. The moment unfolded with no warning, no buildup, just heat. Not the kind that radiates from debate or conviction, but the kind that flashes from ego when it feels cornered. J.D. Vance, who had spent the last hour wrapped in rehearsed restraint, suddenly snapped. His body jerked forward, one palm hitting the desk with a dull, controlled thud. Not loud enough to be called an outburst, but loud enough that everyone heard it. A collective pause swept the room. His voice followed, stripped of polish, sharp with fury. "You're a disgrace," he spat the words, clipped unfiltered, meant to wound rather than persuade. "A destroyer of everything this country stands for." The insult didn't come from reason, it came from loss. Not loss of a debate, loss of narrative, loss of control. His voice cracked just slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer velocity of suppressed rage now flooding out. "You don't represent America," he continued, jabbing his finger toward Jasmine without quite pointing. "You represent chaos. You represent weakness." The hearing room, once tense with anticipation, now pulsed with something darker, disbelief. His words echoing through microphones and broadcast feeds were not just defensive, they were revealing. He wasn't debating anymore. He was unraveling, and everyone knew it. Staffers sat stiffly. Senators lowered their eyes. Even some of his allies shifted in discomfort, unsure of whether to follow his anger or fear its implications. Because what Vance had just said didn't sound like leadership. It sounded like fragility trying to masquerade as patriotism. But Jasmine remained motionless. Her chair didn't creak. Her fingers didn't twitch. Her breathing didn't change. She had seen this before, not just in politics, but in courtrooms, in community centers, in back rooms, where power thought it could shout its way out of the truth. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't meet his volume. She simply watched with the kind of measured calm that only comes from knowing exactly what's coming next. Then, with a small, deliberate motion, she reached for the black remote beside her binder. No drama, no announcement, one click. The screen behind her flickered, brightened, and then settled on a video window. The timestamp in the corner read 2016. The clip began just 10 seconds. No voiceover, no music. Just J.D. Vance, years younger, on stage at a conservative panel in a smaller, less controlled world. The camera was steady, the microphone clear, his face slightly flushed with passion, and his voice, "Trump is dangerous. He's America's Hitler." The footage paused. It didn't need context. It didn't need editing. There was no ambiguity, no escape hatch. It wasn't some AI-generated deepfake or partisan smear. It was him, on tape, loud, clear, and unafraid, at least back then. A tremor rippled across the room. Not loud, not public, but deeply felt. because even those who had spent the last years bending backward to protect the image of Trump, and by extension, Vance couldn't unhear what had just played. And even they had to reconcile that the man who now painted himself as the standard bearer of American strength had once issued a warning so dire, so explicit, that it could not be walked back with sound bites or spin. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't have to. She had memorized every second of that video, not because she needed it as a weapon, but because it was the moment she had realized what men like J.D. Vance were capable of. They didn't change their minds. They changed their masks. And today she had ripped one off. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on him, her voice softer than ever. So soft it forced the room to lean in to hear it. Is this the man you're now defending to the end? It wasn't a question in the conventional sense. It was a reckoning, a mirror, a whispered truth so brutal it didn't require volume to be deadly. J.D. Vance opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't look at her. His stare fell somewhere vague, somewhere safe, anywhere, but where the truth was waiting. And in that moment, the hearing didn't feel like a policy review or a partisan clash. It felt like something much deeper. It felt like a trial not just of one man, but of an entire political era built on denial revision and the belief that no one would ever dare show the receipts. But she had, and she wasn't finished. But Jasmine hadn't just come armed with memories and receipts, she had come with paper trails. Because corruption doesn't always show up in scandals. Sometimes it hides in signed checks and quiet contracts written in the language of influence. The lights dimmed once more. Jasmine tapped her tablet, and on the screen behind her appeared a document header, clean-stamped legal. At first glance, it looked like just another campaign contribution report. But as the lines came into focus, it became something far more damning. She stood without saying a word for a moment longer, allowing the room to absorb the title at the top. Memorandum of Understanding America for Family Values. Pack and Vance 2024 Victory Fund. Her voice when it returned was not loud but firm. What you're looking at, she said, is a financial agreement dated October 17th, 2024, a $1.2 million donation to Mr. Vance's re-election committee. She paused, tapping the screen again. From a super PAC that in its own mission statement declares its intent to roll back the moral rot of LGBTQ protections in American law. That phrase hit the room like a steel door slamming shut. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't spin. It was a direct quote highlighted now in red on the projector for all to see. J.D. Vance didn't blink, but his jaw shifted and his fingers curled slightly on the desk. Everyone saw it. Everyone pretended not to. Jasmine's voice remained steady. The agreement contains a commitment clause, she continued, which, while not explicit in legislative terms, outlines a promise to champion traditional family structures through targeted policy mechanisms. Another beat. Then she delivered the next line with clinical precision. The contract was signed exactly one day before Mr. Vance gave his now infamous "Traditional families are the backbone of America" speech in Dallas. The dots were no longer dots. They were a straight line, bright, undeniable damning. And Jasmine wasn't drawing them with suggestion. She was connecting them with fact. The video of that speech began to play Vance at a podium flanked by American flags and red, white, blue lighting, delivering phrases like gender confusion and moral chaos as if they were data points. He had spoken to a crowd of thousands. But now that speech lived in context. Now it lived in blood money. She let the clip roll for only 30 seconds before cutting it. It didn't need to go further. Everyone in the room had already heard it. Most had applauded it back then. But today, under fluorescent lighting and cross-referenced with legal documentation, it felt different. It felt exposed. And then Jasmine turned not dramatically but with quiet force and looked straight at him. Her eyes didn't accuse. They confirmed. And this is what you call moral leadership. The room didn't react immediately. They couldn't. It was the kind of question that didn't leave room for rebuttal. Not because it was inflammatory, but because it was too precise, too real. J.D. Vance didn't rise. He didn't argue. He didn't even shake his head. He just sat there, hands tight, shoulders higher than before, as if trying to hold himself together with posture alone. Jasmine stood in the stillness, her breathing controlled, her stance steady. She wasn't posturing. She wasn't making a scene. She was documenting one. A scene that had happened not in back rooms, not in secret, but in plain sight. A transaction where political power was traded for targeted harm. And no matter how much his speechwriters might polish the words, the ink on that contract said everything. She tapped again. The closing section of the agreement filled the screen. Underlined in bold were the words, "In exchange for financial support, the candidate agrees to uphold and promote legislation that restores family order." Beneath it in crisp black ink was J.D. Vance's signature. The silence was no longer tension. It was verdict. Jasmine had offered no opinion, no editorializing, only evidence. She didn't raise her voice because the facts were already loud enough. And in that moment, every person in the chamber was forced to confront the quiet violence of what had just been exposed. Because this wasn't about a speech. It wasn't about political ideology. It was about deliberate harm sold clean, sold legally, and sold to the highest bidder. And now the price had come due. The chamber may have returned to silence, but beyond its marble walls, the storm had already begun, because truth once seen doesn't stay confined to a hearing room. It started with a single tweet. Just 4 words. "This is the real Vance." Attached was a 15-second clip of Jasmine's confrontation, her calm voice, the damning quote, and Vance's silent, exposed reaction. Within minutes, the clip spread like wildfire. It was shared by veteran students, journalists, celebrities, and everyday Americans who had long felt something was off but never had the receipts. Then came the hashtag Elegy of Hypocrisy. A brutal play on Vance's best-selling memoir. It trended globally within the hour. Screens lit up with it. Comment sections were flooded. Talk shows interrupted programming to cut live to reaction panels. Because this wasn't just political drama, it was revelation. And it was hitting harder than anyone expected. The first real crack came when a former Yale law classmate stepped forward on a live podcast interview. His voice was calm, but his words were a matchstick. "Yeah," he said, "we all knew he plagiarized parts of that thesis. It wasn't a secret. The faculty just didn't want the scandal. They said, 'He's the poster child for Appalachian success, don't ruin that.'" The interviewer paused. "So you're saying they covered it up?" The man nodded. It was contained. But we all knew. The clip was cut, subtitled, and uploaded. 10 million views in 12 hours. Thousands of comments poured in, not just about the plagiarism, but about what it represented, a system that protected prestige over principle. Then came the second blow, quieter but deadlier. A whistleblower from Vance's 2024 campaign, an anonymous staffer hiding behind a scrambled voice in a network interview, spoke just 3 sentences. "We ran a 2-track strategy. Public loyalty to Trump, private disgust." JD knew he had to pretend. He said it plainly. "You don't get on the ticket by telling the truth." The network blurred the face, masked the voice, but the transcript was all anyone needed. People didn't even argue about whether it was real. They felt it was real, because deep down the betrayal matched what they'd always suspected but couldn't prove. Now the narrative began to splinter, and not just in progressive circles. Conservative veterans, evangelicals, and working-class voters, the very groups Vance had claimed to champion, began to ask the question out loud: who is this man really? Was he the outraged populist he sold on stage, or the Ivy League chameleon who said what he had to climb? Old speeches were re-examined, books reinterpreted, headlines rewritten. Editorial boards across the country, from the Dallas Morning News to the Cincinnati Enquirer, ran op-eds titled things like "The Manufactured Image of J.D. Vance" and "From Elegy to Egotism." And then the final blow came not from Washington, but from Akron. A Vietnam veteran named Carl Simmons uploaded a shaky front porch video holding a worn copy of Hillbilly Elegy. His voice cracked with disappointment. "I voted for that man because he said he knew our pain. But you can't fake knowing what it means to bleed for something. You can't fake humility. And son, you can't fake honor." The clip went viral not because it was dramatic, but because it was devastatingly plain. Honest, unrehearsed, real. By the end of the week, Elegy of Hypocrisy had become more than a hashtag. It was a reckoning. It was a movement. Newsrooms began investigating campaign finances. Former classmates came forward with emails. Even members of the current administration distance themselves, issuing lukewarm statements like, "We are reviewing all matters thoroughly," and take academic integrity seriously. But the damage had been done not because of what Jasmine exposed alone, but because she had triggered something deeper. She had punctured a carefully inflated balloon, and now the air was rushing out for all to hear. Everywhere one question began to echo on campuses and churches, in boardrooms and barbershops alike. Who is J.D. Vance really? And for the first time since his political rise began, not even he could answer it without the world holding up a mirror. But as the nation gasped and the mask of integrity lay in tatters, Jasmine reached for her final card, not a document, not a photo, but a voice. Because some truths don't need to be seen, they only need to be heard. The lights in the chamber dimmed again, but this time no one moved. There was no whispering, no shuffling of papers, only the sense that something irreversible was about to happen. Jasmine stood still, her fingers tightening slightly around the audio remote. The room had seen fax signatures video, but this was different. This wasn't evidence passed through headlines or court transcripts. This was private, undeniable. A man's voice in a moment he never expected to be recorded, stripped of pretense, scrubbed of political calculation, the raw sound of who he really was when no one was supposed to be listening. Jasmine didn't look at Vance. Not yet. She just said calmly into the mic, "What you are about to hear is a recording from a closed-door donor call in early 2023. She let that sentence hang for 1 second longer than necessary. It was leaked by a former staffer, verified forensically, confirmed by 2 independent sources, no edits, no context needed. She clicked play. The room fell into absolute silence, so complete that even the faint hum of the AC unit in the corner seemed deafening. The recording began with muffled background noise, a cough, a clink of glass. Then came his voice. J.D. Vance. Steady, unfiltered, casually cruel. The truth is, Texans don't need more aid. They need to be taught how to act like civilized people again. There was a short laugh, his, followed by another line thrown off with arrogant ease. Half of that state thinks federal help is a birthright. What they need is discipline, not handouts. Jasmine didn't stop the tape. She didn't need to. The audio stopped itself, clean-clipped, cut off at exactly the point it had done the most damage. No embellishment, no commentary, just silence. And then came the slow, almost imperceptible shift in the room's atmosphere. Lawmakers who had remained stoic now looked away. A few aides shook their heads. One senator mouthed the word, "damn." Then Jasmine raised her head. Her eyes were locked on Vance now, not with fury, but with fire. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped lower, quieter, forcing the room to lean in to catch every word. "You look down on my state, my people. You are not worthy of representing any of us." Her words didn't hit like accusations. They hit like a funeral bell. Final. Irrevocable. Because this wasn't a political rebuke. It was personal. It wasn't about policy anymore. It was about dignity belonging the very identity of a people he had dismissed in private while pretending to champion in public. J.D. Vance didn't speak. For the first time, he truly had nothing to say. His mouth opened, then shut. His eyes drifted not in defiance, not in shame, but in that hollow, stunned paralysis that grips someone when they know the room has turned and there's no speech, no slogan, no carefully crafted lie left to throw. Jasmine stood still, breathing slowly, her presence commanding the space without raising a finger. Her silence now said more than 1,000 indictments, because she hadn't just proven hypocrisy, she had proven contempt for the very people Vance had built his brand pretending to defend. And that kind of truth doesn't fade with press cycles. It echoes. It hardens. It haunts. And now it was public record. Forever. And after the final audio played, after the weight of his own words filled the air with something heavier than silence, J.D. Vance did the one thing no one expected from a man who once claimed to stand unshakable. He stood up and walked out. There was no warning, no gavel, no recess announcement, no whispered cue from an aide, just the slow creak of a leather chair as J.D. Vance pushed back from the table. His fingers pressed into the oak as he stood posture straight, but no longer commanding rigid like a man wearing armor made of shame. The chamber, still reeling from the audio Jasmine had just played, fell into a stunned hush. All eyes were on him, not with the curiosity of a crowd expecting a response, but with the stunned focus of people watching the myth dissolve in real time. He didn't reach for his briefcase. He didn't touch his mic. He didn't glance at the senators beside him or the cameras overhead. He simply turned toward the exit, the soles of his shoes echoing against the polished floor like slow, controlled surrender. The silence in the room was suffocating, not empty, but heavy with all the things he wasn't saying. Reporters didn't shout questions. Lawmakers didn't object. Even the chairperson didn't attempt to halt him, because they all understood something sacred had shifted. The man who had entered that hearing room cloaked in authority was now walking out draped in exposure. And Jasmine Crockett, still seated, still composed, didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was not the absence of a rebuttal, it was the sound of truth having already won. As Vance reached the threshold, a Capitol security officer instinctively stepped aside, not out of protocol, but instinct, like clearing a path for a fallen statue. Cameras tried to track him, but even the sharpest lenses couldn't capture what was unraveling inside his face. It wasn't defeat in the traditional sense. It was something more haunting, the collapse of a carefully constructed identity. For years, Vance had branded himself as the man who bridged two Americas, the Ivy League, and the Rust Belt, the trailer park, and the debate stage. But the bridge had snapped under the weight of his own contradictions, and now the nation was watching the man fall in slow motion. Outside, the hallway was lined with press. Flashes erupted, microphones lunged, questions fired. "Senator, do you deny the tape? Was the campaign donation tied to policy? Do you still stand by your Dallas speech?" But Vance kept walking, eyes forward, lips sealed as if sound itself no longer belonged to him. Behind him, the double doors to the hearing chamber closed with a final soft thud, less like a dismissal and more like a casket lid. Back inside, the energy didn't immediately resume. It couldn't. The space he left behind still carried the imprint of unraveling. Some senators sat stunned, others leaned over to whisper, but no one could ignore what had just happened. J.D. Vance hadn't defended himself. He hadn't denied. He hadn't spun, shouted, or even blinked in defiance. He had simply walked away. And in Washington, where survival is often about who speaks the last word, his silence roared louder than any rebuttal. Jasmine finally moved. She leaned forward slightly, adjusted the mic in front of her, and cleared her throat. Not theatrically, not to reclaim attention, but to mark a shift, an unspoken understanding that the hearing hadn't just changed its direction, it had changed its weight. "Let the record reflect," she said calmly, "that the vice president has chosen to exit the hearing without comment." Her words were procedural, but her voice carried something deeper. Not triumph, not gloating. Something far more difficult, sorrow wrapped in clarity. Because she hadn't set out to destroy a man. She had set out to defend a truth. And the truth had done what it always does, cut through what wasn't real and left the rest in silence. In the following moments, aides rushed to retrieve their notes. Reporters began forming headlines. Social media feeds were already melting with footage of Vance's retreat. And yet inside the chamber, it still felt like time had slowed, like the final breath of a verdict echoing down the marble halls of power. J.D. Vance had walked in a leader. He walked out a question, and no one, no spin team, no press statement, no midnight tweet could undo what had just unfolded. Because when power turns its back on accountability, it doesn't disappear. It forfeits, quietly, publicly, permanently. And as J.D. Vance disappeared beyond the chamber doors without a single word, the silence he left behind became the loudest admission of all, a moment that didn't just end a hearing, but ignited a reckoning. The doors thudded shut behind him, but the echoes reverberated long after. Reporters swarmed, cameras jolted, and the flash of phones illuminated the corridor like a battlefield after the last cannon blast. Inside the chamber, there was no applause, no clapping, just the heavy breath of reality settling in. What had begun as a standard oversight session had transformed live on record into a collapse of political illusion. The marble walls seemed to constrict around everyone present, as if even the architecture itself recognized the gravity of what had just happened. A vice president had not just walked out, he had abandoned his own defense. In a city addicted to noise, his silence was a deafening confession, and Congress responded. That very evening, the Oversight Committee filed a formal resolution to initiate a full-scale ethics investigation into Vice President J.D. Vance. The charges: abuse of influence, misuse of campaign funds tied to targeted policy, concealment of academic misconduct, breach of public trust. The motion passed without hesitation. Not a single Democrat opposed it, and even a few Republicans, stiff-collared and red-faced, lowered their eyes and abstained from protest. They had watched the tape. They had heard the voice. They had seen the man flinch and flee, and they knew this wasn't politics. This was a matter of truth, and truth was now on record. The news exploded across networks before the ink dried. Live updates scrolled across screens in airports, office buildings, and late-night diners. Breaking: J.D. Vance under ethics investigation. Hashtags shifted from curiosity to fury. Editorial boards pivoted. Former allies grew silent. The machinery of government, slow as it was, had begun to move, not to protect one of its own, but to examine him under a microscope lit by public fury. But in the chamber itself, one voice still had not spoken. Jasmine Crockett sat with her hands folded in front of her. Her face bore no triumph. Her eyes weren't lit with vengeance. If anything, there was a kind of solemn stillness to her. The storm had passed, but the damage it revealed was still smoking. She didn't stand immediately. She waited until the room caught up with the truth, until every camera turned back toward her, not for theater, but for resolution. Then slowly she rose. Her microphone was already hot, but her voice when it came wasn't sharp. It was grounded, full. The voice of someone who had carried the weight of knowing long before the world was ready to listen. Let the record reflect, she began her words, careful, crisp, and deliberate, that I did not come here to humiliate a man. She looked around, eyes sweeping senators, staffers, press, then landing briefly on the empty chair where J.D. Vance had sat. I did not come here to ruin a career. I came here to expose a system that protects the powerful while crushing the unheard. She paused, not for effect, but for truth. The room was motionless, holding its breath with her. And then she said it quietly, with more conviction than any headline could carry. I don't need him to fail. I need this country to wake up. The words didn't just echo, they etched themselves into the floor. No shouting, no pounding of fists. Just an undeniable clarity that cut through the spin, the tribalism, the performance of government. Jasmine wasn't asking for blood. She was asking for memory. She was asking for America to remember who it claimed to be and to notice who it had become. And in that moment, even her political enemies didn't interrupt. Not because they agreed, but because they understood. Because what she had just said wasn't a partisan attack, it was a civic alarm. A reminder that democracy doesn't die in darkness anymore. It dies in excuses, in silence, in signatures behind closed doors, in speeches funded by the people they target. And she had pulled back the curtain for all to see. As she sat back down, the weight of her words didn't dissipate, it settled into the bones of the room. Committee members looked at one another with the understanding that history had just drawn a line, and they were each on one side of it. Reporters scrambled to rewrite their scripts in real time, capturing not just the facts, but the shift in national tone. Citizens watching from living rooms and phones and bars didn't cheer. They stared. They replayed. They listened. And for the first time in a long time, they believed that someone in that building had chosen justice, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. No gavel was struck. No closing statement read. But everyone knew it was over. And something else had just begun. But as the hearing chamber emptied and the last word etched itself into congressional record, something larger was already underway, far from microphones, far from marble walls, in the very place J.D. Vance had tried to diminish the streets of Texas. It began in Dallas. Not with politicians or press, but with people, teachers, veterans, mothers, janitors, students. They weren't holding party flags or chanting rehearsed slogans. They stood shoulder to shoulder outside the city courthouse, wrapped in the dry Texas heat, gripping signs they had written by hand. One read, "We are not disposable." Another, "Tell the truth, even when it burns." But the phrase that kept rising, the one that spilled from voices into headlines, from hashtags into chants, was printed in thick black ink across canvas banners: integrity over elegy. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a rejection of betrayal, of false prophets, of the man who once claimed to represent them while secretly trading their dignity for political access. By noon, the crowd had tripled. The march bled down Main Street, flanked by stunned shopkeepers and local reporters, broadcasting live from sidewalks that had turned into arteries of awakening. Helicopters circled overhead, catching aerial shots of a movement that had no single leader, because the truth was leading now. And at the heart of it were people who for too long had been spoken for but never heard. A mother holding her daughter's hand past the camera, her voice cracking as she said, "He called us uncivilized. But we raise our kids. We build our churches. We bury our dead with pride. We didn't ask for a savior. We just asked to be respected." By nightfall, the movement had spread Houston, Austin, El Paso, even border towns that rarely made the news. In each place, the signs remained the same: integrity over elegy. But what changed was the sound. It grew not angry, not chaotic, but firm. A wall of voices rising in unison. "We are not stepping back," they chanted. "We are not ashamed. We are not props in anyone's memoir." The air pulsed with a clarity that felt almost sacred. It wasn't about political revenge. It was about collective memory reclaiming its own voice after being distorted, softened, sold. And the world watched. International media picked up the coverage. Headlines crossed languages, from hillbilly hero to ethics crisis. The backlash J.D. Vance didn't see coming. In Europe, commentators drew parallels to failed populists. In South America, newspapers quoted Jasmine Crockett's now viral line, "I don't need him to fail. I need this country to wake up." But the most powerful stories weren't told on screens. They came from the streets, from voices amplified not by platform, but by pain. A retired oil worker in Lubbock spoke to a reporter with tears drying on his cheeks. "I read that damn book 3 times. I gave copies to my sons. I thought he understood us. But now I see he didn't come from us. He climbed over us." A group of high schoolers in San Antonio passed out water bottles with QR codes linking to voter registration forms. A church in Waco rang its bells at 7 p.m. Sharp, a moment of moral reflection, not for Vance, but for everyone who had once mistaken his ambition for advocacy. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent. Not out of absence, but respect. She didn't tweet. She didn't speak to the press. She watched quietly from her district office in Texas, surrounded by photos of community leaders, court victories, and constituents she knew by name. When her aide asked if she wanted to release a statement, she shook her head and said, "They're already speaking louder than I ever could, because this wasn't her movement, it was theirs." It was what happens when the lie collapses and the people who were always told to sit down finally rise, not with fists but with facts, not with hatred but with history. They didn't want chaos. They didn't want blood. They wanted the truth to matter again. And in their hands, that banner waved across bridges and highways, over churches and into classrooms: integrity over elegy. In one drone shot from Austin, it stretched for 4 city blocks, held up by nurses, firefighters, and immigrant families. The camera zoomed out, and for a moment it looked like it had no beginning and no end. Just a single message stretched across the soul of a state that had been insulted, overlooked, and underestimated. But not anymore. Not ever again. And as the chants faded into the night and the banners fluttered beneath the Texas sky, what remained was not just a fallen politician, but a question echoing far beyond the courthouse steps. What do we do when the truth finally stands up and the lie walks away? The story wasn't just about J.D. Vance. It never was. It was about a nation lulled by charisma and confused by pedigree. A country that had mistaken polished pain for authentic leadership and narrative for honesty. It was about a community millions strong that had been romanticized in print but demonized in policy. The human cost of that hypocrisy had effaced the mother whose SNAP benefits were cut while Vance dined with donors. The trans teen who heard her humanity debated like legislation. The student expelled for plagiarism while a future vice president had his buried with a scholarship. These were not collateral. These were casualties. And Jasmine Crockett, standing alone in the storm, had simply dared to say enough. The lesson here was never about vengeance. It wasn't about scandal or even the unraveling of a single career. It was about how power, when unchallenged, becomes something more dangerous than corrupt. It becomes convincing. Vance didn't fall because he lied once. He fell because he lied long enough for people to believe the lie had merit. That's what made his silence so deafening. When the moment finally came to answer, to defend, to explain, there was nothing there. No values, no spine, just emptiness where integrity was supposed to live. And in that vacuum, Jasmine stepped forward, not to take his place, but to force the country to face its reflection. What happened in that hearing was bigger than a political moment. It was a moral mirror, and it forced everyone watching on both sides of the aisle, on every end of the screen, to ask themselves, who have we been protecting? And at what cost? It revealed that leadership isn't about knowing the right phrases to say on stage, but having the courage to tell the truth when the lights go off. It reminded us that ethics isn't performative, it's proven. Not in speeches, but in silence. Not in biographies, but in the lives touched by decisions made behind closed doors. And most of all, it taught us something deeply human, that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the voice of a woman who refuses to flinch. Sometimes it walks calmly into a fire built to burn her, and walks out with the truth still intact. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she was louder. She won because she was braver. Because in a room filled with power, she chose principle. And that choice, repeated again and again, is what heals broken systems and broken spirits. We live in an age of distortion, of curated facts and convenient truths. But this story, this reckoning, showed that there is still a place for realness, for records that speak louder than reputations, for leadership that doesn't ask to be worshipped, only trusted. That's what Texas rose for. That's what integrity over elegy meant. Not just a rejection of a man, but a reclamation of meaning, of honesty, of country. So if there's one lesson left from the ashes of that hearing, it's this: when you weaponize the pain of others for political theater, the curtain always falls. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it falls, and when it does, the ones who stood for truth won't have to scream. They'll simply still be standing. And the people finally will be ready to listen. But if this story has shown us the raw anatomy of corruption and the weight of courage, then what comes next isn't contemplation, it's action. Because truth, no matter how powerful, dies in silence unless someone picks it up and carries it forward. The hearing is over. The cameras have dimmed. The man who once called himself a voice for the forgotten has fled wordless from the very people he promised to serve. But this is where the story begins, not in the fall of J.D. Vance, but in the rise of those who finally saw through him. And now the burden doesn't rest on Jasmine alone. It rests on you. Because injustice doesn't vanish when the mask falls. It adapts. It waits for you to look away. It banks on your exhaustion. It survives by feeding on your silence. If you watch that moment, if your breath caught when Jasmine said, "I don't need him to fail. I need this country to wake up," then know this: she wasn't speaking to Vance. She was speaking to you. To everyone who's ever believed that their voice was too small, that their community was too overlooked, that their truth was too inconvenient. To every teacher too tired to fight the next book ban. To every parent afraid their child's identity might be debated in a courtroom. To every factory worker, veteran immigrant, and dreamer who's ever been used as a story but never handed a seat at the table. Now is the time. Not for rage, but for responsibility. Share the footage, but then read the contracts. Post the quotes, but then show up at the meetings. Know your lawmakers, know your judges, know who funds their campaigns and what policies they're trading your dignity for. Because what happened in that chamber was not just betrayal, it was calculated betrayal. $1 million check exchanged for erasure. A speech delivered not for unity, but for the applause of those who never bore its consequences. And it will happen again unless we stop it. So no, don't be content with watching Jasmine Crockett dismantle a system. Join her. Don't applaud her bravery and then disappear into digital shadows. Stand with her. Stand like her. Be the quiet voice that refuses to back down. Be the student who calls out the biased principal. Be the journalist who refuses to write what they're told. Be the voter who shows up every single time, not just when it's convenient, but when it's necessary. Because every hearing room has a back door. Every politician has an exit strategy. And every lie, no matter how well dressed, is waiting for your distraction to survive. We can't let that happen. Not this time. Not after everything. So if you believe in justice, act like it. If you believe in equality, protect it. If you believe in truth, fight for it like it's bleeding in your hands. Because it is. And if you ever forget what that looks like, go back to that moment. The moment the tape played, the moment the banner waved, the moment a woman stood alone and said, "You insult a nation bleeding for its sovereignty while never once wearing the uniform of your own." Remember the hush that followed. Remember the weight of that silence. Then let it move you. Write letters. Knock doors. Protect libraries. Build coalitions. Refuse the comfort of cynicism. Challenge your community not just to care, but to act. Because no movement survives on hashtags. It survives on hours, on organizing, on ordinary people doing extraordinary things when no one is watching. This is your chance, not to punish someone else, but to protect what matters. To say never again, not in my town, not on my ballot, not in my name. And when they ask where you were when integrity was under attack, you'll have an answer. Right here, still standing, still speaking, still fighting. Because history doesn't just remember who spoke, it remembers who stayed silent. It remembers the names of the brave and the excuses of the comfortable. And one day, long after the cameras are gone and the trending hashtags have burned out, there will still be a record of whether you stood or sat, whether you leaned in or looked away. That record will not be written by politicians. It will be written by you, by your children, by the people who inherit the ground you fought for or surrendered. Do not wait for the perfect leader. Do not wait for the perfect moment. Courage never comes with permission slips. It comes when the stakes are high, when the odds are long, and when you decide that fear is not enough to stop you. The truth is simple. The system will not save itself. Integrity will not rise from ashes on its own. It takes hands, voices, bodies, persistence. It takes you. So let this be your call. To defend the fragile, to shield the honest, to lift the broken, to confront the powerful. Because justice is not abstract, it is alive, and it is waiting for you to keep it breathing. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.